Welcome to the People Teaching People podcast. I'm so glad that you're here. Every day we move through a world of people. Some we know well, some we recognize, some we might pass by without a second thought. There is the person at the checkout, your kids' teachers, a coworker you see in meetings, the server bringing your food, the people you pass walking down the street. Each one of them is carrying a story shaped by experiences, relationships, losses, hopes, and questions you'll probably never fully see. Everyone has a story, and remembering that can change how we move through the world with one another. Over the years, I've been reminded again and again that every person we meet is living a story shaped by experiences we often know nothing about. And when we slow down long enough to remember that, it changes how we listen, how we connect, and how we show up with each other, especially in a world that can feel tense and disconnected. There's a quote by organizational psychologist Adam Grant that I've always loved, and I bring it up again and again. He says, "The mark of a lifelong learner is recognizing that you can learn something from everyone you meet." That line feels true to me in the most everyday way. Not because everyone we meet has advice to give or that every interaction is profound, but because every person carries stories. And inside those stories are perspectives and experiences and lessons we might not see otherwise. Just over 6 years ago, in February 2020, I started this podcast here in my basement without a studio or a clear roadmap, just a microphone. In fact, the one I still use today, a lot of curiosity and a willingness to be new at something that I was going to be sharing with the world. This is my 137th episode. I've done 63 episodes of the Part-Time Jungle podcast. And then when I switched over to what my podcast is today, the People Teaching People podcast, I've done another 73. I've had 125 guests, and I still don't feel like anywhere close to being an expert at podcasting. I felt vulnerable when I started, and honestly, I still feel vulnerable now because every conversation is a bit of an invitation to listen well, to ask thoughtful questions, and to really honor someone else's story. I've always been a curious person, and I've always been a pretty quiet person. I'm pretty much never, ever the loudest one in the room. I love to listen. And at the same time, I'm also a planner. I'm very type A. I still prepare questions in advance for every podcast conversation. Having that structure helps me feel grounded. But what's changed over the years is how willing I am to let go of the plan once the conversation starts. I notice myself now more relaxing into the moment and following the thread of someone's story when it takes an unexpected turn. I'm really more so letting curiosity lead instead of sticking too tightly to my outline. And some of the most meaningful moments on this podcast have come from those unscripted turns. One early example that really stayed with me was a conversation I had with a sleep coach named Eva Klein. And we started in what would feel like expected territory. We were talking about sleep strategies for busy moms and kids and routines and habits and all that practical stuff. And then the conversation widened. She began sharing about relationships and about reevaluating who we allow into our inner circles and about being really protective of our emotional energy. And what that gave me was an opportunity to get to know Eva more fully as a human, to see how her lived experiences shapes how she thinks about rest and boundaries and care. And it reminded me that behind every area of expertise, there's a person with a story. And when we make space for that story, the conversation becomes so much more than just information. Another moment like this happened when I spoke with Katrina Lemay-Doan, an Olympic and world champion speed skater, a flag bearer for Canada. But what I was most grateful for in our conversation was getting to hear the human side of her story, the uncertainty, the wondering what comes next, and the vulnerability of stepping into something new after a long chapter as a high performance athlete. It was another reminder that even when someone's achievements are well known, there's always more to their story than what we see from the outside. And I felt this again and again in conversations with people as I get even small glimpses into the stories that have shaped who they are. Like Madeline Shaw. So, Madeline's a social entrepreneur and writer based in Vancouver and the co founder of Isle, which is one of the early businesses to bring reusable menstrual products into the mainstream. And we talked about menstrual equity, about access to products, education, and dignity, and about how something as basic as having what you need each month can shape whether someone feels able to fully participate in school, work, and everyday life. What stood out to me wasn't just the issue itself, but how personal it was for her. You could hear how much her work is rooted in her own story and values, a desire to reduce shame, to make something that's often treated as private or taboo feel more human and more supported, and to build something that actually changes people's day-to-day experiences. And in listening to Madeline, it was clear that her work isn't separate from her story. The business she's building and the conversations she's trying to shift are really such an extension of what she cares about and how she sees the world. It put language to something I already hold about education. It's not just about information. It's about helping people feel seen, heard, and understood. And she also shared that so much of social entrepreneurship comes down to relationships, not just systems and strategies, relationships, the way we build trust, community, and the way we invite people into a story. And these are so much bigger than just a transaction. And I remember thinking, of course, because this podcast isn't really about teaching and learning in isolation, it's about people learning in relationship with one another. Then there's Karen Lane. Karen is a nurse and clinical instructor whose story is inseparable from how she shows up in her work. Her own experiences as a patient shaped the kind of nurse she became and the kind of educator she is today. So when she talks about relational practice, she's not talking about a theory. She's talking about lived experience and about what it feels like to be vulnerable, to be dependent on care, and to be deeply affected by how someone shows up for you in moments when you don't have much control. That conversation stayed with me long after we stopped recording because it reminded me that the way we practice our work is so often shaped by the stories we've lived. And then there's Monica and Robin from Mint Cleaning. And on the surface, they run a product-based company, eco-friendly cleaning products, a growing brand. But their story isn't really about just products. It's about friendship and community and learning through missteps and about building something in a way that stays human. Their business didn't just grow out of a market opportunity, it grew out of their story, their health experiences, their relationships, and their desire to build something that reflects their values. Listening to Monica and Robin, it's clear that their brand is an extension of the kind of community they've already created and they want to keep nurturing. The way they show up online and engage with customers, and the way they share resources and behind the scenes moments. All of it reflects a deep commitment to relationship and care. That sense of community isn't a side effect of their success. It's been central to it. Each of these conversations has been less about being impressed by what people do and more about getting to know who they are. In each case, there's different industries, different life paths, different stories, but there are some similar human threads. And this idea really came alive for me recently when I attended my 30th reunion at Pearson College. I spent 2 years there with 200 students from 87 different countries. We learned together, ate together, went to school together, shared stories late into the night. We came from different cultures, in many cases spoke different languages, carried different traditions and life experiences, and yet there were those common threads. We all had hopes and fears and questions about who we were becoming and how we wanted to show up in the world. In many ways, it made the world feel smaller, and it still does, because when I hear stories on the news about events happening in other countries, they land differently. They're not abstract places. They're connected to faces, names, memories, and people. I once sat beside in a classroom and shared many meals and many adventures with. There's a quote from Lester B. Pearson that I keep coming back to. In his Nobel Peace Prize lecture back in 1957, he asked, "How can there be peace without people understanding each other? And how can this be if they don't know each other?" That question feels just as relevant now because understanding doesn't come from headlines. It comes from proximity, from shared space, from listening to stories that expand our sense of who we includes. And one more layer I've been thinking about lately is not just the stories we hear, but which stories we're used to hearing and who gets to tell them. So much of what we think we know about people, places, and events come from the versions of stories we've been told. Through history, through media, through what shows up in our feeds. And sometimes there's more to the story than the version we've been given. Sometimes there are voices missing and perspectives left out and experiences we haven't been invited into yet. And holding that awareness gently has helped me to stay a lot more open and a little less certain that I have the full picture, along with more curious about what I might still have to learn. And I think that's what all these stories have been pointing me toward. Whether it's sitting in a classroom with people from around the world or listening to a founder talk about building something from scratch, or hearing an Olympic athlete wonder what comes next, or a nurse talk about how lived experience shapes how she shows up. The details of the stories are different, but the invitation underneath them is the same: to see the person, to stay curious, to let stories make the world feel a little smaller and our connections to each other feel a little more possible. For me, this isn't just about being interested in people's stories. It's about making space to really see the human behind them. One of my hopes with this podcast has always been to invite more presence, more listening, more curiosity, more remembering that people are layered and complex and still becoming. Because when we really listen, we start to notice what we would have missed: the courage behind a decision, the grief behind defensiveness, the hope beneath uncertainty. Listening doesn't always change the situation, but it often changes us. Even as someone who loves listening, this is still a practice for me. I catch myself wanting to jump in, fix or relate or move things along. So here's a small try this practice that I've been returning to. The next time someone is sharing something, especially something personal or unexpected, try pausing before you respond. Not to plan your next question, not to think about what you'll say next, just to let what they said land. Try one of these. Can you tell me more about that? What was that like for you? I'm curious what that brought up for you. So, no fixing, no advice, just space. It's a small shift, but it changes the quality of connection in quiet, meaningful ways. So, here's the reflection I want to leave you with today. Who is someone in your life, or even someone on the edges of your life, whose story you're curious to know more about? Where might curiosity soften something that feels tense? What question could you ask instead of making an assumption? What might you learn if you slow down long enough to listen? You don't need a podcast to practice this. You can practice it in a meeting, in a conversation with a neighbor, with a colleague, with a family member, even with yourself. Everyone has a story, including you. And the more we remember that, the more human our learning, our work, and our relationships become. Thank you for joining me today on the People Teaching People podcast. If this episode resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to send me an email or reach out on social media. And if you think someone else could benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Thank you for listening. Let's keep learning and listening to and exploring people's stories together.